Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar, Collectively Grieving the World as We Knew It, with Patrick Arbore. He is the founder and director of the Center for Elderly Suicide Prevention at the Institute on Aging. He's a great speaker and storyteller, and I feel really lucky that we have him here today. I want to remind everyone, if they hover at the bottom of their screen, they will find a Q&A icon, and you're welcome to type in your questions. At any point during the talk, we plan to leave at least 10 to 15 minutes at the end for Patrick to answer your questions. I also want to let you know this webinar is being recorded and will be available for the future. And I believe everyone got an email with a PDF of the slides. So with that, we'll let Patrick take it away. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Sarah, very much. And as I said to Sarah through emails, is that I'm really grateful that she and her co-host are on this Zoom meeting because I get a little anxious on this platform. So I'm very grateful they're here. And if you could go to the next slide. As Sarah said, I'm the founder and director of the Center for Elderly Suicide Prevention and Grief-Related Services. And we began actually 47 years ago with the creation of the Friendship Line for the elderly. And it's an accredited crisis intervention hotline as well as a warm line for people 60 plus who are possibly depressed or isolated, lonely, bereaved, maybe substance abusers, and or suicidal. And we also welcome people younger than 60 who are dealing with mental health issues or physical health issues as well. And recently, that's why that Friendship Line California number is different than our regular number, because the Department of Aging, the California Department of Aging, with this pandemic, realized that Friendship Line could do more. However, we were really stymied by lack of resources. And so they have been a very strong support and advocate for the Friendship Line. And so that number, for those of you that might live in other counties or other states, you can also use that 888 number. Friendship Line has always reached out to all counties in California, and we also receive a lot of calls from across the country as well. And we've always done that, but we've never had enough money to do marketing and enough resources to be able to respond to the calls. And just for your information, so you get a sense of the breadth of this, is that Friendship Line, you know, on a daily basis, usually receives between 500 and 600 contacts in a day. Since about I think the third week in March, that number went quickly up to 800 calls a day, and then it went up to 1,000 calls per day. And now it's hovering around 1,500 calls or 2,000 per day. So people are really reaching out, and I think that's part of the title of this talk, has to do with this kind of collective grief. And I myself spend hours and hours on the phone with people who have suffered traumatic losses, or, you know, just losses that have been experienced over a lifetime that are really much more, you know, up for them since this pandemic has descended upon us. Next slide. And just about the center, we also provide traumatic loss grief services, which include individual grief counseling. We have a Saturday morning drop-in grief group, and these services are for people of any age, adults of any age. And if you know someone who might want to participate in a Saturday morning drop-in grief group. We are now doing them through Zoom, and we do have room to add people if they would like to know about it. All you have to do is send me an email. My email is on the bottom of this slide. And if you have any questions about the Friendship Line, both Friendship Line California or our original Friendship Line, please contact me at Grig, and there's my contact information as well. Next slide. So I think that we're all pretty aware that this COVID-19 pandemic is both an epidemiological crisis as well as a psychological crisis. And, uh, and there's just so much stress associated not only with the those of you that have known people, and I've known people who have had the coronavirus, and I do know, unfortunately, of some older people who have died as a result of that in other counties. And, so there's a lot of sadness attached to it. But the stress is also not just the pandemic itself or this virus exclusively, it's also all the information that we're hearing through the media, whether it's radio or the internet or television. Um, and the news often varies significantly between experts in the field, like Dr. Fauci or others, Department of Public Health officials, and then politicians. And I was just saying to Sarah earlier that this morning I've already talked to, three of my older grievers, and what they keep talking about is the fear they have that the society would be better off without them, uh, so that the economy could open up. And if they died, well, that's you know, they're being very good Americans for, dying, and so the economy could continue to open. And they're afraid, and that's what I'm, really reminded of as we're doing this call, is that I'm just thinking of one of the older women that I talked to, and when I call her and she answers the phone, the first thing she says is, "I'm scared to death. I'm scared to death," and and it's so concerning to me that that's how she is living. And I know she's not the only person that is living with this underlying sense of dread and fear. And of course, she says to me each time I call her, do you know when this is going to change? Do you know when it's going to be safe? And of course, it's all this is not something that I can predict. Um, and then I can tell in the call that her anxiety lessens. Her voice sounds, calmer. Um, and all I say to her is, just tell me how you're feeling, and then she does, and I can see, that just that phone call, and of course she's someone I call 3 or 4 times a week, and she'll say at the end of the call, as people do when they call the friendship line, is that, it's just they're so grateful that they can reach out and talk about stuff in a meaningful way, and then the other thing I was thinking as I was putting these slides together the other day, is that we also have to look at ourselves in terms of what we would call countertransference. Um, in terms of that third point there, this is a time of collective sorrow that I think all of us, regardless of our training and background and relationships, um, are also not immune to this underlying anxiety, this underlying stress. And the thing I see in the people with whom I talk is that their coping mechanisms that they used on a regular basis are not working for them anymore because they can't, let's say, go to the senior center, or they can't go with their um, friends on a walk that they have done before and for maybe years, uh, that they don't feel safe outside because they see people with without masks, and that scares them. Um, and there's just a lot of sadness about what has been lost, which is seems so long ago now in what January or December, um, that we might not ever get back to that. We're going to get back to something, but it might not be uh, our normal way of operating in the world. You know, uh, Weir states, she says, and I like this quote very much, it's important that we start recognizing that we're in the middle of this collective grief and we're all losing something now, something uh, for each of us. And I can feel it when I'm on these calls that I have to be just very aware of my own feelings and my own stress. And and I think for all of us, who are helpers, caregivers, you know, um, sons or daughters or mothers and fathers, I think we have to really assess how we're doing on a regular basis. Next slide. Yeah, this is Walsh is a researcher who has been looking at the effects of disasters and other issues, and the relationship with these kinds of events with trauma. And she writes that with traumatic experiences, the body, mind, spirit, and relationships with others can be wounded. And I really appreciate that term wounded, because the Latin word for trauma is wound. And I think that that's how a lot of us feel, is that we feel wounded in some way. And yet it's not as it's more clear, I think, when we actually lose someone to death, that someone dies, and we can, as sad as that is, as tragic as that is to lose a loved one, that it's pretty clear, okay, somebody died, and my response, fits, in some way, you know. But I think it's much more challenging in a way when things are more ambiguous, and we'll talk about ambiguous loss in a little bit. Trauma can involve multiple losses, including, and but not limited to, these ones that I mentioned. Um, and it has to do with this way of life, as I was talking about a few minutes ago. Uh, the way of life and the economic livelihood that we had been used to, and and I think that is a major issue for people, especially people that may have had a full-time job at a restaurant, or a full-time job in what was, what's being called non-essential services. And uh, and I know a lot of my older clients are really concerned about the status of their son or daughter, or grandchildren, um, many of whom have been laid off or out of work. And um, and that can just be really devastating when we don't have any idea when this is going to change. Losses that uh, can be or feel very traumatic have to do with hopes and dreams for what might have been. When we hear about all of these, let's say weddings or events, that anniversaries or graduations and baptisms or whatever they might be, um, that aren't happening, that there's just tremendous sorrow around that. And probably many of you on this meeting know of people who were going to graduate in May or June, and those graduations are not going to happen, or the parties associated with them. And uh, and and I know we all feel, sadness for those individuals who were looking forward after, high school, 4 years, or college or university, uh, to have that experience of, having accomplished something and having people praise them. We've seen these images either on the internet or on the television where people in nursing homes or assisted livings had to be quarantined and their loved ones weren't there to celebrate a birthday. And we see the ones on TV where people have made a big to do about it. But you and I know that there are many people in nursing homes or other places where seniors live that no one is applauding for them, and they're really really lonely. Trauma is associated also with lack of control and unpredictability. That's what I hear from my clients is that, as I said, what they want to know is, can you tell me when this is going to be over? And I can hear the anxiety in their voices, uh, and and just how traumatized they feel, um, and this, the lack of control, and when it intersects with this unpredictability, what generally surfaces is fear and anxiety, and and just the shattered assumptions about the world. And I'm sure you're hearing this too, and it's very heavy when people say, "I've never experienced anything like this," or "I was." Born in the, let's say, 1930s, but I was a baby or a toddler during the Great Depression of the 1929 30s, and up probably until the World War II. Uh, that was tremendously devastating for this society, and here we are again. But for so many of us, this is a brand new experience. And it's very, again, that, our assumptions about the world, about our plans for the future, have all been having to be put on hold. And that can also be very traumatizing for us. The next slide, please. And as I was mentioning earlier, you know, ambiguous loss is when there is a lack of clarity, but there is a grief response. And this type of loss doesn't have, as I said earlier, the finality of the death of a loved one. Um, Lacking clarity makes it very hard to move forward. And that's one of the things that we're kind of all in this petri dish of a sense of tremendous sadness and loss, um, and and it doesn't seem to have any movement. It just kind of adds on. Things are added on to it, and it's very hard to move forward. And people get stuck. And I think that's important for us to keep in mind when we talk to people who are, just sad every day. That what we have to not do is not try to push them into feeling better, or to present some kind of a rosy picture that, oh, in a couple weeks we'll be, going to Golden Gate Park and being able to have a picnic. I think we have to be very careful, because one of the things that grief uh, is dependent upon has to do with helpers, whether professionals or paraprofessionals, you know, don't push people beyond their limit, you know, so don't push towards health too quickly. Um, and that's just something to I think be aware of, and we can't predict all the types of losses that may be coming as this pandemic continues. And again, that's part of the anxiety that is surfacing for so many of us since this experience has occurred. Uh, we're also says in this American Psychological Association newsletter that I'm quoting, we're talking about grieving a living loss, one that keeps going and going. So, in addition to the 82,000 or more people that have died as a result of this virus, um, that there's also this kind of living loss that we're all in, which is, will my favorite restaurants open again? Will I be able to hang out with my friends again? Um, you know, will I be able to see my loved ones again? So there's this living experience of grief that is very hard, I think, for people to manage. Next slide, please. And this idea that we have been sheltering in place, and we are quarantined, and you know um, many people who can are working from home, so they don't have the usual interactions with people. To be quarantined can be defined as the separation and restriction of movement of people who have possibly been exposed to the virus. So, we've been certainly here in San Francisco, City and County, and other counties across the country, and in California, we've been encouraged where possible to stay at home, don't do non essential business if you don't have to. And, uh, and that can be very painful. And for people that have to be out, like uh, the first responders, or nurses and doctors, and CNAs and facility people, that have to go to work, and grocery store people. There's so many people who are out there every day having to serve their communities, but they're also scared too about this pandemic. Separation from loved ones, loss of freedom, uncertainty, boredom can provoke intense feelings. That include suicidal thoughts, and anger, and anxiety, insomnia, depression, emotional exhaustion, just to name a few. And as I'm saying these things, I'm aware, as I was saying to Sarah earlier, of that feeling of exhaustion. I do work all day, um, and I'm not in traffic or walking or whatever. And but all the things I used to do that really helped take care of myself, exercising, or spending time with friends and family, that's all been taken away. And yet I am so fatigued, I can hardly stand it. And I know that's part of this experience, um, you know, that has to do with loneliness. Could you go to the next slide? You know, um, and so what we're seeing, as I said about suicidal ideation, um, is that we need to be aware of this risk of suicide. And some of you probably already know this, is that the suicide rates have been increasing every year since about 1999. Um, and for example, in 2018, which is the last official data from the American Association of Suicidology, the actual number of people who died by suicide of all ages or ethnicity and gender was 48,344. And in 2017, that number was something like 47,000. In in 2016, that was something like 43,000. And 2000, in the year 2000, the uh, numbers of people that died in the United States was something like 25,000. So, in just from 20,000 till, from the year 2000 and 1999 to 2018, that has risen to 47,000 or 48,000. And and the expectation of the American Federation of Suicide Prevention nationally is that we're going to see an even larger increase in suicide. And some of the reasons for that is this ongoing stress uh, that people are having a hard time managing, uh, living in fear on a daily basis. Whatever coping we have is being eroded on a regular basis. Worry over loved ones, especially those who are older. Uh, and we know with certainly with nursing homes and assisted livings, there's a great deal of concern about the residents. So there's just a lot of stress, and that stress can contribute to feelings of depression, um, substance abuse. Um, I need to escape from this kind of experience that we're having, and then social isolation are the three of the most important risk factors for older adult suicide, and it's important to remember that older adults have a high risk of suicide anyway. Uh, Men 85 plus are 15 times more likely to die by suicide than women of the same age, and so we need to be very thoughtful. When we are talking to our clients or caring for our clients, that we need to really pay attention to any change in their mood. Um, and I wanted to refer to, again, social isolation and why that is one of the three most important risk factors for suicide, certainly older adult suicide, but also younger people as well. And some of these names you may have heard before. There are people like Dr. John Cacioppo, who is now deceased. He died in his early 60s about a year ago, which was really unfortunate. Some of you are familiar with Dr. Carla Parasanato, who is a geriatrician from UCSF, who has done a lot of work on loneliness. And I wanted to share something from Dr. Cacioppo's evolutionary theory of loneliness, uh, which was rooted in the observation that humans have survived as a species, uh, not because we have physical advantages over other creatures, uh, but because of our ability to connect in social groups, you know, and and he goes on to say that our brains are wired to seek connection, to focus our thoughts on other people and to define ourselves by the people who surround us. And we are, as humans, we are hardwired to connect, and that has been evolving, since humans started populating the earth, and this sense of being together in towns or villages or cities is very strongly you know, um, integrated into our DNA. And so when you wonder why people who are isolated or lonely um, are having a difficult time, it's because something that is very natural for us, which is to connect, um, is now something that is seen as unsafe, that especially with this virus where somebody may have the virus um, and be asymptomatic and potentially could infect other people. And so it's important for us to really think about the role of loneliness and social isolation and how that contributes to these feelings of trauma and loss and depression and substance abuse. The thing I wanted to say also about substance abuse that we've known for a very long time. I can remember back in the 80s when I first kind of heard this expression, which was, you know, substance abuse, particularly alcohol, uh, is a hidden epidemic among older people. And and this was said in the 80s, and people were like aware of it, people especially working in aging. And uh, and then in 2016, a physician by the name of Dr. Chang had said in, I think the periodical was Internal Medicine News, and she said, you know, substance abuse, particularly alcohol abuse, is a hidden epidemic among older people. And it's like, you know, we need to pay attention to that, and how, especially now during this COVID um, virus, that we need to kind of ask some difficult questions of people, which is, you know, how are you coping? And we know that older people, probably more so than younger people, uh, are going to avoid saying they cope by drinking, and we're going to need to find ways to talk about that. Next slide, please. So, one of the things that we need to be able to do is that we need to be able to, um, you know, check in on people. That's one of the things that we can do through the friendship line. We can call out to people, outreach to people. I call out to people all day long. We're doing the Zoom meetings online. Uh, so we need to, if I can't myself check in on people, do I know places or agencies that can do something like this? Um, we need to keep the support going for people even after the quarantine ends. And the reason I say that, it's based on the literature from the bombings back in 9/11, uh, where so many people at those towers in New York, 3,000 people had died in the Pentagon, and in Pennsylvania, and in Pennsylvania, that airliner. And what they discovered is that even many years after 9/11, that people were still dealing with trauma, and and the implication is that, you know, even when hopefully we have a vaccine at some time in the near future, we're going to be living with the remnants of this pandemic emotionally for people for a long time. And it's not just like, okay, we're rinsing our hands of that, it's all over. We want to be aware also of cultural and spiritual values and practices which can provide meaning and purpose for some people. And so we want to be able to invite people that we see in person or that we are talking to on the phone or the internet, uh, is to look at how one's culture is providing support, you know, or people's spiritual values are really helping them manage through this time, especially for those people that were very regular attendees at church services, or at temples, or attended spiritual gatherings like such as Spirit Rock, or other places. People that meditated and tended to do that in groups. And I know there's a lot of online support, and I think it's really important. I think it's so important as a resource to think about, um, the AA 12-step program, or ACA, or Al Anon. I know they do a lot of work online. And I think we need to help people who have relied on these groups or these activities or these gatherings, that if they can't do them in person right now, you know are they willing to do something online? The other footnote to this is, and I'm certainly guilty of this too, I'm not the most technologically inclined person, I'm sure, on this call. and I get anxious, trying to make sure that I can do the Zoom meetings or the go-to meetings or whatever they might be, and I find it kind of stressful. And but many older people, and I've heard this from the older people themselves, who will say, my daughter just keeps insisting that I can do Zoom, and yet I'm all flustered. I can't do it. I don't know what happens. Why it goes wrong, and they're really anxious about it. And so I think we need to just be very thoughtful about encouraging people to do things that some of you might find really easy to do, uh, but for some older people that might not work. I'm 72, and I still work full time, etc. But at Institute on Aging, I have an IT department, um, which is very handy, as many of you know. But here at home, I live alone. I don't have an IT department, and and I can get very anxious. So I just encourage us to be compassionate and understanding, and not push technology too hard, or they're going to get really they're going to feel abandoned. You know, um, Prayer, meditative practices, and faith communities can provide support as well. And again, I think we need to be aware of what's available. Covia, I know, has what used to be called Senior Center Without Walls. I know that they are providing support, and they reach out. They have a very wide net. You know, um, I know San Francisco Village here in San Francisco has a lot of support for uh, older people, especially people who live alone. I think the village movement, in your communities, if you're not here in San Francisco, I know they're doing the best they can, suicide prevention centers. So it's good to be reminded of places where people can reach out. Next slide, please, Sarah. And what can we do? Suffering, this is what I think is part of this collective sorrow that we are finding ourselves in. People who suffer, I just, it really breaks my heart to think that there are people just in our communities or neighborhoods who are by themselves, regardless of their age, who might be really suffering. People that have, prior mental health issues, maybe substance abuse issues. And, I'm aware of that with many of my clients are people with substance abuse, and I know many of them have relapsed as a result of this not being able to attend meetings, and many of them find it very difficult to do so online. And again, we've got these difficult conversations that I was mentioning earlier. What that um, means is that we've got to be able to say to somebody, you know, for example, we can say to an older person, I know many people that are managing their fear or their anxiety um, by drinking alcoholic beverages, and I'm just wondering if that is something that you might do, or are you thinking about doing, you know, um, and we need to talk about that. We need to be able to say to people, because of, I think what this whole pandemic is telling us is that we don't know, you know, if we are going to contract the virus. We don't know if we might wind up, very, very sick, or that we might die. And I think the other thing, and I know that people find this very hard when I say it, but we really need to ask people about do not resuscitate orders, or, do you want, you know, uh, any kind of, response to your health issue. If you have, COPD, do you want to be resuscitated? We need to talk about that. We need to talk about, you know, um, end of life planning. We need to talk about, a living will. And I know that's hard, but it's like, you know, this pandemic just kind of boom hit us. Um, and we weren't ready for it. And those 80 some thousand people, for which I feel a great deal of empathy for and their families, they might not have been prepared. And I think we need to really think about this. We need to be able to ask people um, about their coping mechanisms, which might include drinking, which might include, behaviors that are really not helpful or supportive. Um, but we can look at also things, on the plus side, that how can we ease some of our suffering? Well, music, I think that's one of the reasons why people enjoy, church gatherings or concerts. There's something about music that can be very uplifting to the spirit, can be very healing to this ongoing pain. So I would encourage you to have discussions, with your clients or families, like, you know, um, what kind of music do you like to listen to that help? Helping people find ways to increase resilience can be facilitated through, art or writing or dance, movement, singing, literature, films, and sometimes people just need to be encouraged. I have one older person with whom I talk who once, always when I call, she just sings a song. Uh, it just makes me sad. That matters to her, and and I really just feel her pain kind of moving, like during that, just what, 2 minutes or something. And then I know she feels better because somebody listened to her sing. We want to facilitate an environment of trust and empathy and acceptance of a range of emotions. Next slide, please, Sarah. We want to encourage, as I said, oh, where are we? Oh, yeah, I said some of them. Encourage social media, such as, for those who are, you know, um, um, are technologically savvy and who are already on Facebook, or, who can text. I think those are platforms that have a lot of useful benefits. Um, but I do, however, feel that there's such an importance to hearing a human voice, or seeing a familiar face. So whether you're on the phone or FaceTime or Zoom or GoToMeet, whatever it might be, it doesn't. I just think there's something about the human voice that can convey a type of energy that really, reveals one's caring, and that's what I see with so many of these individuals who are lonely and isolated, is that they just want to hear that somebody cares about them. Um, and we want to, as I said, that not everybody is technologically savvy, and they become more anxious sometimes when confronted with systems for which they are unfamiliar. The next slide, please. And we need to be able to initiate these conversations, I was saying, around end of life. See, vocabulary, is so important to have, and that's what I think gets in the way. That we just don't have the vocabulary to talk about grief. But what I want to really also encourage us, that especially for people that have had losses during this time of crisis, uh, even if the person hadn't died in any way connected to the COVID-19, uh, but they're going to be particularly sensitive because now they might not have had the opportunity to have a funeral, or some kind of recognition of the loss of the individual. It's very painful for people not to have that type of gathering. So in addition to weddings or anniversaries or Mother's Day or whatever, not being able to have a memorial service can be extraordinarily painful for people. And I really believe, after all my years of working in grief, that we need to be able to ask people about how they're feeling about that. And they might have some really deep sadness and deep sorrow about that. And I so encourage us to be able to help them verbalize that. You know, to talk about how they are coping, with loneliness, and keeping in mind also that what Dr. Cacioppo mentioned him earlier had talked about that loneliness, one of the consequences of loneliness or isolation, uh, is the surfacing of anxiety. Because again, as human creatures, we're not used to this. We're not used to day after day of not being around people. And I understand when people want to, when they're protesting this quarantine and are going to the Capitol buildings across the country or whatever and are mad about it. I get that what they can't talk about is how, as human creatures, they are just hardwired to connect. Um, and not having that availability is really causing them a great deal of anxiety and anger. Um, and so, what we can do is encourage anxious people to minimize watching, reading, or listening to the news about the virus, um, and try to help people create a range of other coping strategies. The next slide, please. So, just as kind of in summary, in terms of strategies that we might want to use in terms of communication with people during this very challenging time in which we find ourselves, is that we want to remember that grief and loss is a uniquely personal experience. That, what I see that grief is very connected to is how we were taught uh, as children. What did our parents, our grandparents, our relatives, people in our cultural community, how did they grieve? And that's going to play a role in how they grieve now as an older person. And uh, and I think it's very helpful to talk about that, because then we can see the uniqueness, um, in terms of how they were raised and maybe how you yourself were raised. And again, pacing. Don't push people to feel good when they're grieving, because it's totally um, opposite of what they're feeling inside. What we can do again is listen. I just think that is one of the basic cornerstones of our communication process, is just, can I listen? Can I give this other person attention? And I think people are starving for that these days, starving for attention. And I can do that by phone or whatever. um, and I think we need to keep that in mind. We want to reassure individuals that you, all of us on this meeting, will not abandon them, and will do our best to encourage them to reach out for others. As I said, reach out for the, call the friendship line, or participate in any meetings online that you can, uh, and then just be aware of the resources in your communities that can support lonely people. And uh, and then finally, I just want to say, as I mentioned earlier, uh, is that I urge us to exhibit self care, you know, that with our families or with our partners or spouses or friends, our coworkers, if you are in connection with them, I just urge us to, model self care. And if we ourselves are really feeling stressed and anxious, can we ask for help? I think it's really hard to encourage other people to ask for help or to talk about, difficult things if we ourselves can't do that. So I think we have to really practice uh, with ourselves and with others the very thing we want to encourage with our clients or consumers, so that, for at least this moment, we can feel, as Dr. Edwin Schneidman would say, who was the founder of the suicide prevention movement in the United States. He said, you don't have to cure anybody or fix them. You just want them to feel a noticeably better, that it doesn't have to be great. It can just be, in this moment, I feel better than I did in the moment before. Um, so now I think Sarah said we will have some time for questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a lot to take in and process. So we have a couple of questions. I just want to remind people to type in their questions, use the Q&A icon to type in their questions. The first question is asking for suggestions on ways people who are religious or practice, have faith practices, that if they're not comfortable with technology, ways that they can maintain these practices under quarantine.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I think it's a challenging one. Um, but here's what I have been doing with people when they don't have, see, a lot of people I work with are poor, so they don't even have a cell phone. They might have a landline. They might not, a computer might just be so out of their grasp. Um, but what I urge them to do is, if they do belong to a faith community, whatever that might be, is to really reach out to uh, the pastor, to the rabbi, to the priest, to the, whoever that is, and to and reach out by telephone, because most people have access to a landline, and I urge them to do that. But that means asking for help. It means, you know, I need to ask for help, and I know many faith communities have people who are willing to volunteer, and to try to find a way to connect, um, and carry the message of that particular faith to that individual. So that would be at least one approach that I have found, that people in these communities are willing to reach out to people. So that might be a way to do that.
Great. We're getting more questions. So Rob has a question. Is it appropriate to create hope in these times, considering the real reality? I had a similar question when you mentioned that you want to try to avoid pushing people to feel better before they're ready. And we hear about positive psychology and trying to focus on gratitude and things like that. So is there a way to have to allow to hold the grief and try to notice something positive or hopeful?
Yeah, I think it is what we have to be aware of is that, as I'm sure we probably have all heard this phrase, but I think it comes in really handy nowadays, that I think hope on its own is not a strategy that should be the only strategy that we talk about. I think hope needs to be supported um, through, believing in people, connecting with people. And so I think, as you're saying, Sarah, I think we just cannot be false and provide false hope for people, which is, oh, you'll be fine in a couple weeks, or one day we'll be laughing about this pandemic. See, I don't think that those are helpful strategies. I think what is really helpful, and it's a basic element in communication, is honesty. And I think it's really important to be able to recognize the what is really happening in our world, and to notice that. But as you're suggesting, Sarah, and I think it's really important, is to be able to acknowledge what is really challenging and difficult for me, and and what are some coping strategies that I could use. And as I probably said earlier, that when I talk to these people, they start off feeling really badly, and they're sad and mad and upset. And then through the call, and by the end, they say to me, "Oh, I'm so glad you called, and I feel so much better." See, and then I focus on that, and I say, "What's really important right now is that I hear you, and I hear you laugh. You're laughing about something silly I said or they said, and look, even in this pandemic, we can still laugh.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we can still see that something is okay right now, you know. And I say to people so often, what is it that we have right now for which we are grateful? You know, and just it might just be one thing on their list, but I
Mhm,
encourage them to try to make a list, you
mhm,
know. You have a roof over your head. I mean, I go for the basics, you know.
mhm.
Uh, do you have food today? Do you have your medications? You know, is there anybody else that you talk to? Often what they'll tell me is they're grateful for their caregiver. I just want to put a shout out there. Caregivers are really important, whether it's a professional caregiver or a family caregiver. You know, they'll say sometimes a friendship line volunteer, you know, they'll say, you know, their mother or father. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to say to people too, and I know time is precious and clicking here, uh, is that if you have loved ones that you are concerned about, don't forget the power of a, if the person has, you know, the capacity to read, doesn't have severe vision problems, is to write a letter, you know, a card, you know. Um, can I, and I hear this all the time from my people on the phone, and they'll say to me, I got a card in the mail. Like, you know, remember we used to get cards in the mail
Mhm.
often, you know, now it's kind of a strange occasion. But it means so much because what they always say is they took the time to write this. So it really infuses them with a sense of joy, to which
Yeah,
I leap on that, which is, see, that even with all these difficulties and concerns we have and anxiety, that made you so happy. You know,
yeah,
let's just rejoice in that. You know, so
yeah.
it's the little things that
That's
I think
great.
we don't want to overlook.
Thank you. I'm not going to be able to get all the questions. I wanted to ask this other one. I think it goes along with what you were talking about. Self-care is recognizing as caregivers when we might be experiencing compassion fatigue.
Well, that's a really good question because I think probably a lot of us right now on this meeting are suffering from compassion fatigue. I think we could be just an example of it. And yet, I think it's the having purpose, you know, um, and having meaningful connections ourselves are one of the ways that we can reduce the risk of compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue is basically the high cost of caring, that we're so busy caring for others that we are not caring for ourselves. And that's why I said a couple times earlier, I really urge us to practice what it is we are wanting our clients or consumers to do. We have to be doing that ourselves, and I'm hoping that everyone is looking at their coping strategies, so that if they start to feel again exhausted, if they start to feel fatigued, if they start to feel like, wow, there's so much pain in the world, that we reach out to others. Uh, can we ask for help? And that's really one of the ways that we can mitigate the negative aspects of compassion fatigue, and to do activities that bring joy to our hearts and our souls. And that might be, you know, again, music, or, you know, movement, or, you know, just sitting in the park by ourselves looking at a plant grow, you know.
Mm.
Uh, Life is still happening around us, and we need to um, be part of that. And so, those are just some things that I think are important in terms of managing our high degree of caring.
Yeah.